Today we're reading Owls in the Family, and we're on chapter 8. It's by Farley Mowat. The banks of the Saskatchewan River were very steep, where the river ran through the prairie to the south of Saskatoon, and about 2 miles downstream from the city was a perfect place for digging caves. Bruce and Murray and I had our summer headquarters down there in an old cave some hobos had dug a long time ago. They had fixed it up with logs and pieces of wood so it wouldn't collapse. You have to be careful of caves, because if you don't have good strong logs to hold up the roof, the whole thing can collapse on you and kill you. This was a good cave, though. My dad had even come there to look it over to make sure it was safe for us. It had a door made of a piece of tin roofing, and there was a smokestack going up through the ceiling. Inside was a sort of bench that you could lie down on, and we had 2 old butter crates for chairs. We put dry hair down on the floor for a carpet, and under the hay was a secret hole where we could hide anything that was especially valuable. The river ran only a hop, skip, and a jump from the door of the cave. There was a big sandbar close by which made a backwater where the current was slow enough for swimming. Standing right beside the swimming hole was the biggest cottonwood tree in the whole of Saskatchewan. One of its branches stuck straight out over the water, and there were old marks on it where a rope had cut into the bark. An Indian who'd been chased by the Mounties a long, long time ago was supposed to have hanged himself on that branch so the Mounties wouldn't catch him alive. We used to go down to our cave a couple times a week during summer holidays, and usually we took the owls along. Wool had learned how to ride on the handles of my bicycle, but Weeps couldn't keep his balance there, so we built a kind of box for him and tied it to the carrier behind the seat. There's a picture on the front cover of it. Mutt and Rex used to come too, chasing cows whenever they got a chance or racing across the prairie after jackrabbits. We would bike out to the end of 3rd Avenue and then along an old Indian trail that ran along the top of the riverbank. When we got close to the cave, we would hide our bikes in the willows and then climb down the bank and follow a secret path. There were some pretty tough kids in Saskatoon, and we didn't want them finding our cave if we could help it. Wool loved these trips. All the way out, he would bounce up and down on the handlebars, hooting to himself with excitement, or hooting out insults to any passing dog. When we came to the place where we hid the bikes, he would fly up into the poplars and follow us through the tops of the trees. He usually stayed pretty close, though, because if he didn't, some crows would be sure to spot him, and then they would call up all the other crows for miles around and try to mob him. Then when that happened, he would come zooming down to the cave and bang on the door with his beak until we let him in. He wasn't afraid of the crows. It was just that he couldn't fight back when they tormented him. As for Weeps, he usually stayed right in the cave where he felt safe. Oh, here's a picture in black and white that I showed you a minute ago on the cover. One summer afternoon, when we were there at the cave, we decided to go for a swim. The 3 of us shucked off our clothes and raced for the sandbar, hollering at each other, "Last one in's a Dutchman!" In half a minute, we were in the water, splashing around and rolling in the slippery black mud along the edge of the sandbar. It was great stuff to fight with, nice and soft and slithery. It packed into mushy mud balls and made wonderful splash when they hit something. Whenever we went swimming, Wool would come along and find a perch in the hanging tree where he could watch the fun. He would get out on the big limbs that hung over the water, and the more fuss and noise we made, the more excited he became. He would walk back and forth along the limb, hoo-hooing and ruffling his feathers, and you could tell felt he was missing out on the fun. This particular day, he couldn't stand it any longer, so he came down out of the tree and waddled to the river's edge. We were skylarking on the sandbar when I saw him, so I gave a yell, "Hey, Wool, come here! Wool, old owl, come on out here!" Of course, I thought he would fly across a strip of open water and land and light on the dry sand where we were playing. But I forgot Wool never had any experience with the water before, except in his drinking bowl at home. He got his experience in a hurry. Instead of spreading his wings, he lifted up one foot very deliberately and started to walk across the water towards us. It didn't take him long to find out he couldn't do it. There was an almighty splash, and spray flew every which way. By the time we raced across and fished him out, he was half drowned and about the sickest-looking bird you ever saw. His feathers were plastered down till he looked as skinny as a plucked chicken. The slimy black mud hadn't improved his looks much either. I carried him ashore, but he didn't thank me for it. His feelings were hurt worse than he was, and after he had shaken most of the water out of his feathers, he went galumphing off through the woods towards home on foot. He was too wet to fly, without a backward glance. Toward the middle of July, Bruce and I got permission from our parents to spend the night in the cave. Murray couldn't come because his mother wouldn't let him. We took Wool and Weeps with us, and of course we had both dogs. In the afternoon, we went for a hike over the prairie looking for birds. Mutt, who was running out ahead of us, flushed a prairie chicken off her nest. There were 10 eggs in the nest, and they were just hatching out. We sat beside the nest and watched. In an hour's time, 7 of the little chickens had hatched before our eyes. It was pretty exciting to see, and Wool seemed just as curious about it as we were. Then all of a sudden, 3 of the newly hatched little birds slipped out of the nest and scuttled straight for Wool. Before we could move, they were underneath him, crowding against his big feet and peeping happily. I guess they thought he was their mother, because they hadn't seen their real mother yet. Wool was surprised and didn't know what to do. He kept lifting up one foot, then the other, to shake off from the little ones. When the other 4 babies joined the first 3, Wool got nervous. But finally he seemed to resign himself to being a mother, and he fluffed his feathers out and lowered himself very gently to the ground. Bruce and I nearly died laughing. The sight of the baby prairie chickens popping their heads out through Wool's feathers and that great big beak of his snapping anxiously in the air right over their heads was the silliest thing I'd ever seen. I guess Wool knew it was silly too, but he couldn't figure out how to get out of the mess he was in. He kept looking at me as if he were saying, "For heaven's sake, do something." I don't know how long he would have stayed there, but we began to worry that the real mother might not find the chicks, and so I finally lifted him up and put him on my shoulder, and we went back to the cave for supper. We had a good laugh at Wool, but he had the laugh on us before the day was done. After we had eaten, we decided to go down to the riverbank and wait for the sun to set. A pair of coyotes lived on the opposite bank of the river, and every evening just at sunset, one of them would climb a little hill and sit there and howl. It was a scary sound, but we liked it because it made us feel that this was the olden times, and the prairie belonged to us, to the buffaloes and the Indians and the prairie wolves. Wool was sitting on the hanging tree, and Rex and Mutt had gone off somewhere on a hunting trip of their own. It was growing dusk when we heard a lot of crashing in the trees behind us. We turned around just as 2 big kids came into sight. They were 2 of the toughest kids in Saskatoon. If they hadn't come on us so suddenly, we would have been running before they ever saw us. But now it was too late to run. They would have caught us before we could go 10 feet. The only thing we could do was sit where we were and hope they would leave us alone. What a hope that was! They came right over, and one of them reached down and grabbed Bruce and started to twist his arm behind his back. "Listen, you little rats," he said. "We heard you got a cave down here somewhere. You're too young to own a cave, so we're taking over. You show us where it is, or I'll twist your arm right off." The other big kid made a grab for me, but I slipped past him and was just starting to run when he stuck his foot out and tripped me. Then he sat on me. "Say, Joe," he said to his pal, "I got an idea. Either these kids tell us where the cave is, or we tie him to the old hanging tree and we leave him there all night with Injun's ghost." Just then the coyote across the river gave a howl. All 4 of us jumped a little, what with the talk of ghosts. But Joe said, "That ain't nothing, just a coyote howling. You gonna tell us, kid, or do we tie you to the tree?" Bruce and I knew they were only trying to scare us, but we were scared, all right. I was just opening my mouth to tell him where the cave was when Wool took a hand in the things. He had been sitting in the big limb of the hanging tree, and since it was almost dark by then, he looked like a big white blob up there. I don't think he'd been paying much attention to what was happening on the ground below him, but when that coyote howled, he must have thought it was some kind of a challenge. He opened his beak and gave the owl hunting scream. Did you ever hear a horned owl scream? Usually they do it at night to scare any mice or rabbits that happen to be hiding near into jumping or running. Then the owl whoops down and grabs them. If you've ever heard an owl scream, you know it's just about the most scary sound in the world. When Wool cut loose, it even made my skin creep, and I knew what it was, but the 2 big kids didn't know. Their heads jerked up, and they saw the ghostly white shape that was Wool up there in the hanging tree. And then they were off and running. They went right through the poplar woods like a couple of charging buffaloes, and we could still hear them breaking bush when they were half a mile away. My guess is they ran all the way to Saskatoon. When they were out of hearing, Bruce stood up and began rubbing his arm. Then he looked at Wool. "Boy," he said, "you sure scared those 2 roughnecks silly, but did you have to scare me right out of my skin too?" "Hoo-hoo, hoo-hoo-hoo!" Wool chuckled as he floated down out of the tree and lit on my shoulder.